Hi, and welcome once again to Honors Biology at Desert Ridge High School. I'm Mr. Galladay, and this is VodCast 10B. For those of you that aren't aware, the VodCast 10 was just a little bit too long, so I'm having to split it up into two parts, Part A and Part B. And I would suggest you go ahead and start a new page of notes on lipids. Lipids is the subject that we're going to be talking about here. So this is a good point if you need to update your table of contents or update your organization in your notebook. This is a good point to do that. Lipids are, we know them often as fats or oils. They can be things that are liquids at room temperature, such as vegetable oil, but they can also be things like butter or margarine or lard or Crisco. These are things that are more or less sort of a solid at room temperature. And both of these things fall into the category of lipids, and lipids, of course, are part of our dietary requirements, and that's because they're a part of all of our cells, and they are very important biological molecules. I'm going to go back to the food label that we looked at earlier, and we looked at the carbohydrate section of this food label, and I'm going to look at the part of the food label today that talks about the fats. And if you've looked at labels like this before, you may have seen some of these terms before. So here again, like with the carbohydrates, we see at the top in bold letters we see the total, and then underneath it we see the parts that make up that total, or at least some of them. And here, kind of like with the carbohydrates, they don't all add up to the total. So we see saturated fat 0, trans fat 0, polyunsaturated fat, whatever that is 1 gram, and monounsaturated fat is 0 grams. Okay, we're going to be explaining some of that terminology as we go through today's presentation. Now, it's not quite as simple an explanation as it was with carbohydrates as far as why these things don't add up to 2.5. For that, it takes a little bit more knowledge of chemistry. There are things like glycerides, as well as some things which are called sugar alcohols or glycerols, which are things which are somewhere between a lipid and an alcohol, and there are lots of chemical things that fall into that category. The chemistry of all of that is a little bit beyond what we need to know about here, but let's just suffice it to say that it is quite common that these things won't add all up, and it's not necessarily anything to do with food manufacturers being deceitful or anything like that. It just is to simplify because of the chemistry involved gets a little bit too complex. All right, we're going to go on now and look at what lipids are and start off with a few definitions. Oh, before I move off of this, the thing that I wanted you to get from seeing this is that just as with carbohydrates, we have different types of fats or different types of lipids. And the thing to understand here, and we'll be seeing in detail somewhat what this is this difference between saturated and unsaturated. And we'll get into what those are, as well as what a trans fat or a trans lipid, what that is, in just a moment. Okay, so what is a lipid? Well, it's maybe easier in this case to give you some examples, and this includes things like oils, fats, waxes, and so forth. Many of these are naturally occurring, which means they are produced by living things. So oils, fats, waxes such as your earwax or beeswax, or the waxy coating that is on many of our desert plants, are all classified as lipids. The thing about lipids that makes them rather unique is that they do not mix with water. They are hydrophobic. Most of us are aware, if you've ever seen a jar of salad dressing, right? You've seen that the oil and the water don't mix. No matter how much you shake it, you put it back in the refrigerator, come back a little while later, and once again the oil and the vinegar has separated. The oil and the water are separated. What we say is that lipids are molecules that are hydrophobic. That means that they do not mix with water. within cells and within living things, they have many, many, many functions. Every cell membrane of every living cell is composed of some lipids. So these are biologically extremely important molecules. We're going to be looking at some molecules called phospholipids, which are lipids which have a phosphate attached to one end of them. And these are extremely important biological molecules, as we'll be seeing soon. Lipids are also very efficient for energy storage. That's because 1 gram of fat contains more energy than 1 gram of protein or 1 gram of carbohydrate. So what that means is that if an organism has a great deal of excess energy that it needs to store in one way or another, an efficient way to do that is to store it as fat. And of course we all are, or well, not all of us, but many of us are aware of that, particularly as we come into the holiday time. We sometimes see the results of that. Another use of lipids, particularly in our part of the world, we see lots and lots of plants that have waxy coatings. If you've ever seen the surface of cactus, and I'm not talking about the spines, but the actual surface of the plant, it is sort of a waxy surface, and that is indeed a wax, and that is a lipid that is there to prevent water loss. So these are the functions that lipids perform for living things. They are composed of chains of long chains of hydrocarbons, which is basically carbon and hydrogen atoms, which are all bonded together in a pattern that we'll see in just a minute. Saturated fats, when we say that a fat is saturated, that means that they're a solid at room temperature. So for example, butter or margarine or lard, these are all things that at room temperature are basically a solid. Unsaturated fats, on the other hand, are things that are usually a liquid at room temperature. And it turns out that this has a chemical, very specific chemical meaning as well. And what that is, I'm going to show you now in a couple of pictures. And these pictures I do want you to add into your notes. So be sure that you make a sketch of these two diagrams in your notes. Okay, these are the monomers that make up lipids. The monomers that make these things up are called fatty acids. The reason that they're a very weak acid because of this carboxyl group at this end, and you don't need to know anything about that particularly, but you see that it's this long chain of carbon with a bunch of hydrogens, carbon with a bunch of hydrogens, carbon with a bunch of hydrogens, carbons with hydrogens, okay, this long chain, and this most fatty acids would be even much longer than this, okay? So this is an example of what we would call a saturated lipid or a saturated fat. And the reason that it is saturated is because it is saturated with hydrogen. What that basically means is every carbon needs to have 4 bonds connected to it. It has 4 pairs of electrons that it wants to share. And as you can see, every single one of these is being shared with a hydrogen. You could not squeeze any more hydrogens onto this molecule if you wanted to. Now, this one, on the other hand, is unsaturated. Okay, and what that means is you look at this molecule, you see these gaps. And what that actually forms, instead of being a long straight chain, it forms rather a kind of a kinked chain, or a chain that has sort of a little bend in it along the length of the chain. And these bends are formed by these double bonds, and this is why these things are liquids rather than solids. These molecules will tend to lay alongside each other very nicely. These, on the other hand, don't want to interact all that much, and so they will form a liquid at room temperature. So the reason that this is said to be unsaturated is because there are spaces taken up by these double bonds, which is basically spaces where there could be a hydrogen. So this molecule has all the possible hydrogens that it can have. This molecule, on the other hand, has spaces for some hydrogens. So the term trans fat, which has been, if you pay attention to food labels, then you know that this is something that's been very much of importance within the last few years. A trans fat is something which started off as an unsaturated fat, let's say corn oil. Corn oil is a liquid at room temperature. It's an unsaturated fat. It has several double bonds, which means it's polyunsaturated. Polyunsaturated means that it has several double bonds, which are points of unsaturation. And it has been cooked at high pressure and high temperature in the presence of some hydrogen gas. What that does is that tends to open up these double bonds and form them with a hydrogen molecule. That then gives us a saturated fat. Margarine is an example of a pure trans fat. We take liquid corn oil, we cook it at a very high temperature, very high pressure, with hydrogen gas or with hydrogen molecules around. And what we get as a result of that is the stuff that we call margarine, which is a solid at room temperature and has many of the same properties as butter, which is, of course, a saturated fat. Okay, so that is just a quick explanation of what we mean by saturated fats, unsaturated fats. That is the main thing to understand here. And again, I do want you to have diagrams of these in your notes. These are monomers. These are fatty acids. The reason that they're fatty acids is because of this little structure here at one end of the molecule. The rest of the molecule, if it's a saturated fat, is just carbons with hydrogen. If it's a saturated fat, it is carbons with hydrogens and the occasional double bond. Polyunsaturated means many points of double bonds. A monounsaturated fat would mean, guess what? Just one double bond. This would be a diunsaturated fat, which you don't hear of too often, but mostly we call things either poly, meaning many, or mono, meaning one. Okay, I'm going to wrap it up here. This has been VodCast 10B. I'm Mr. Galladay for Desert Ridge High School Honors Biology, and I hope you have a great day. Thanks for watching.